dialogue, and now I'm coming to the really honorable possibility of having the two first speakers here, not only because of their prominence or what, but also because it is a collaborative art series, and I think it's a really nice and, like I said, a kickoff to start also with a collaborative practice between the two speakers. So it's reflected on what you will hear today. We, as Carl mentioned, we had a seminar today, so it is connected to education, but it wants to reach out. And I think we also have today the very exciting occasion of like a fresh new paper. But I'm saying a little bit about the two speakers, not so much the Google thing, but why I think that it's important for us to have them here. Geoffrey Bowker is professor of informatics at the University of California. There's tons of things that you can maybe better read on Wikipedia and all the publications. So, as I said, I'm picking out the things that I like to highlight. And there was one thing that I really, talking about the nerds, I like that he's a professor of cyber scholarship. Whatever that is, I'm very excited about it. He has been trained and published across disciplines. That's also very important for us, as most of us, or me speaking from an art practice that looks into other fields of sciences, that looks into history of technology, medicine, and also, or that with a perspective of the future, that more of these collaborations should happen. He's trained in anthropology. That's also very important, I think, for not only what I call pattern recognition after William Gibson, but for his contribution to infrastructure and the value of infrastructures. He has also recently, and that is again super important for us, published a lot on extinction, biodiversity, and value structures and digital networks. I would even say that this is some kind of cultural theory, at least in my own nerdy way, but it definitely is a basis of expertise that can reach across the disciplines, as well as to the arts and what Anat Singh calls the arts of living on a damaged planet. He has also published with his former partner and devoted a lot of his career to examining the values embedded within socio-technical infrastructures, such as databases, visualization strategies, and science and engineering standards. He has been heavily invested in values, and that's also what I like to highlight, because I'm very interested in ethics in these fields and practices, and it's of immense importance what he has contributed to the field, and I might not be the one that can actually judge on that, but I like to have that for us as a background. And he has collaborated, and that brings us to our collaboration here with artists, and I think that these kind of collaborations are what we have to train ourselves and also look into for the future. Especially in the age of what is called the Anthropocene, and we spent the afternoon in discussing why we don't like or what is the problem with that, and also, but it is also connected to, like I said before, questions of infrastructures and their values. The last thing that I would like to mention, and we also talked a little bit in the seminar, is topics that maybe don't get so often looked at, like politics of care and suffering, not only from the medical fields, but also from the sciences. And this, again, I think is something that our time urgently needs. So with this, I'm coming to our second speaker and partner in crime here, which is, again, for another bunch of reasons, an immense pleasure to introduce Bodhisattva Chattopadhyay. Even if we know since a while, I still can't pronounce that name, but that is like on my nerdy problem, who is, I have to say, a collaborator and a very dear friend indeed in the field of collaborations across disciplines. He's a researcher at the Department of Cultural Studies and Oriental Languages in Oslo. He's also published widely, and I'm not quoting so many, or actually I wanted to mention 2 publications of Geoffrey Bowker before, so that I do a little bit of the Wikipedia, but one of the main publications is Understanding Infrastructure, the Dynamics and Tensions and Design, which also brings us to why this is so important to the arts. And I'd like to highlight another one, Memory Practices in the Sciences, which is also maybe sometimes that you don't really think so much about, but actually an interesting infrastructure topic. So coming back to Bodhi, who is part of the University of Oslo and a researcher especially in the field of science fiction, genre fiction. He's an editor on a lot of things, but I like to highlight the book series Studies in Global Genre Fiction. Sorry, this is a bit of a weird, I did it wrong. And the editor-in-chief of Fafnir, Nordic Journal of Fiction and Fantasy Research. So, like I said, I think it's a fantastic kickoff, and I'm already sad for all the people that were missing out. But they are both also involved, and I know some people in the audience do know about this project, Lifetimes, at the University of Oslo, which is something that's concerned about temporalities as a rough introduction. And I think this paper that we're very lucky to hear today will maybe make this clear, why we're talking about temporalities and also why this is such an important topic now in culture and in a global geopolitical framework. So I'm very happy to hear about the ants and the manifesto today, and I'm handing over with a big welcome.
Thank you, Susan, for that lovely intro, and thank you, Kunsthall, Trondheim, Carl, and it's a real pleasure to be here. What we're going to kind of like talk about today, and I'm glad that we have a really good audience, in the sense that this is kind of a work in progress. So this last year, both of us have been at the Center for Advanced Study at the Norwegian Academy of Science and Letters, where we have been collaborating on, we have been collaborating for a while, but over here we started to think about ants and writing a paper together on ants and ants in science fiction, because science fiction is one of the things, amongst many things, that both of us really enjoy. And so we had a call out for a special issue of Nature Culture. We were invited to contribute a paper to it, and it was on Anthropocene fictions and science fiction and so on. So we decided to write for this, and we also decided to be really experimental. What this paper is really like is that it is a set of 3 stories that go together, and then extensive footnotes, and a manifesto which follows from the argument of the stories. So I'm not going to read out the stories, we are not going to read out the stories, because it will be out in Nature Culture and you can read it then. But what we are kind of going to talk about is we're going to go briefly from what these stories are, a brief synopsis, and then digging into the history of ants in science fiction, and then finally moving from there to some other topics and the manifesto itself. So yeah, and comments, feedback, yeah, tomatoes, everything welcome. These three stories are what we call in the beginning, and then, and towards the beginning. This does not really suggest a kind of a temporal progression. We don't know where these stories are actually placed and in what sequence one should read them, because they flow in columns parallelly. And the footnotes are also kind of digressive in the sense that they attach themselves to different stories at different points, so they don't really follow a sequence in that sense either. So the first one is about humans on a damaged planet, really, and trying to figure out ways of survival on that damaged planet. And what they are doing is that they are looking at different species, different animals and insects, and specifically ants, and trying to use these and think with these for survival strategies on this damaged planet. And from there, the second one goes straight into some undefined future where we have many different hybrids, and we don't know what kind of creatures these are, but they are trying to discover or rediscover the history of what happened before, much as archaeologists do. And in the third one, we have a story about, again, we don't know where this is seeded, where it's placed, but it's kind of about terraforming and more specifically abiogenesis, or the seeding of life. So yeah, with that I think we can move straight to the first slide and to Jeff.
Sure. First of all, many thanks to Susanne for the kind introduction. And she mentioned artists working with folks from social sciences, but for me it's equally important, it's so important for social scientists to be working with artists at this juncture. And I've done this for a number of years, both with Eben Kirksey, working on the multi-species salon for a number of years, and then more recently with a French collective called Disnovation.org, where we've been working on Earth Overshoot Day, which is the day March 14th in America when we overshoot the amount of natural resources that we have, and we really want to kind of push Earth Overshoot Day. It's really central for thinking politically into the future. So there's some debate over what our period is, and we all know that. Traces remain in three different words according to the ants, which are the Anthropocene, the Anthropocene, and the Anthropocene. And I love it that Bodhi has written that the Anthropocene is probably just a typo. With respect to the Anthropocene, I mean, let's just think about that for a second. I mean, one of the amazing things about humans is we move Earth. That's a lot of what we do, actually. We're geologically, it's not only that we're affecting the surface of the Earth, we're moving things around, we're moving Earth around all the time. Ants are actually, and termites are actually pretty amazing at this. They just discovered in the Brazilian rainforest an area the size of a large country where the termites have been involved in Earth moving for the longest time. And what I'm trying to suggest with this, and what Bodhi and I are talking about a lot, is getting away from this idea of human exceptionalism, that humans are somehow different from other species, that we're somehow special. And I think that that's causing a lot of our problems. Now, with respect to the Anthropocene, because geospheric records show the widespread use of coal in our period, it's interesting to think about this. Timothy Mitchell, who wrote this wonderful book called Carbon Democracy, which is about our reliance on coal and burning past biological productions. Mitchell asserts we are pillaging the past of its biological its biological productions. A single litre of petrol needs about 25 metric tons of ancient marine life. And that every year we burn 400 years of the entire plant and animal production a year. So we're eating time. we're using this kind of 400 years per year of the complete production of animal life and biological life on Earth, which is the only way we get the extra energy is through the energy coming in from the sun. We process it one way or another, and then we either store it in the forms of fossil remains or we burn it immediately. It's been very difficult to define what this period is, and there's a whole series of political arguments for how we want to define the current era. One which I like is that it's with the origin of humans, that we have been in the extinction business ever since we came on the face of the Earth, and there's very good arguments for this. One argument drives it back to colonialism, that it's actually there's a thing called the Orbis spike, which was actually an increase in the amount of oxygen in the atmosphere, which was caused by significant depopulation at the time that the Western colonialists brought so many of the injuries, so many of the viruses into South America and wiped out so many people. Or we could define it in terms of the Anthropocene, we could define it in terms of nuclear explosions, so that gives another kind of marker. One of my favourite current markers is actually chicken bones. Chickens are now by far the most popular species of bird on Earth, which is really weird if you think about it. The most popular species of bird is the thing that basically lives in cages under factory conditions, eats its own shit, and then we eat it. There's something strange about this kind of view of what the nature of the world is. So each of these ways of understanding what kind of world we live in is really predicated on how we understand ourselves and how we understand ourselves as a species. And I think this is the kind of series of questions that Bodhi and I really wanted to open out with in our work together. Which is when we get to the Anthropocene and the idea that ants are actually central. Ants act as intelligently as we do in many ways. They, we talk about the exceptionalism of humans. We introduced farming. Well, rubbish. Ants were farming way before we were. There've been ant species which have been farming fungi for many, many millions of years, way before we got round to the question of farming. So this whole idea that something special and different about us is, I think, it's preventing us from thinking usefully and creatively about how we can deal with the future. And so what we've been trying to explore in the paper that we've written together is, let's look at it from the ant's point of view. Let's look at it in terms of ant creation and creativity, and let's see how the world looks like if we don't take ourselves as being at the center of creation.
Ants. In the science fiction imaginary that we work with, ants are the original enemies. The first of the big bugs in big bug films of Hollywood science fiction that would invade us, or at least transform us into their slaves, and at the most extreme, they would wipe us out. The first question of the ants is this other history of the ants. Ants in science fiction, their origins, their locations, and displacements. This history begins with 19th century entomology, before Hollywood gave us its numerous figures with the first social studies of insects, and specifically undergirding the history of ants in science fiction. The first is the figure of the alien, the visitor from outer space, whose form and comportment are often insectoid, but suitably anthropomorphized for our understanding. The second is the figure of the insect itself as an alien, inhabitants of our planet who are our extreme others, but whose very difference makes them a threat to what we are, and also classifications such as the Anthropocene. The third is the figure of the dehumanized other, the insect as the colonial threat. But wherefore and why? If one is to locate 3 early stops in this history of ants moving between languages and countries, we have H.G. Wells's Empire of the Ants from 1905, Premendra Mitra's Pipre Puran, The Ancient History of the Ants, written in Bangla, and Hollywood's own Them from 1954, directed by Gordon Douglas. Next slide, please. So we will begin with a few quotes from H.G. Wells' Empire of the Ants. This is about ants in South America, where the colonizers are just sitting there, and H.G. Wells is borrowing directly here from Joseph Conrad. So they're sitting over there, and they're seeing the ship being taken over by these tiny ants from South America. At the moment, ants are, of course, taking over everything, including much of Northern America, the Californian ants. So this is how the protagonist describes this, and this is straight out of Conrad, Heart of Darkness, really, these ideas. It was the inhuman immensity of this land that astonished and oppressed him. He knew the skies were empty of men. The stars were specks in an incredible vastness of space. He knew the ocean was enormous and untamable. But in England, he had come to think of the land as man's. In England, it is indeed man's. In an atlas too, the land is man's, and all colored to show his claim for it. This anthropocentric view switches to imagining the ants as our enemies. Suppose, presently, the ants began to store knowledge, just as men had done by means of books and records, use weapons, form great empires, sustain a planned and organized war against the humans, ants as the original enemies, but ants here being read specifically in terms of humans. What if ants did as humans do? He says they threaten British Guiana, which cannot be much more over a trifle of 1,000 miles from their present sphere of activity, that the colonial office ought to get to work upon them at once. This is colonization of South America, one of the points for the Anthropocene discourse. He declaims with great passion, these are intelligent ants. Just think what that means. By 1920, they will be halfway down the Amazon. I fix 1950 or 60 at the latest for the discovery of Europe. So from the discovery of South America, the discovery of the Americas, now these ants are going to discover Europe, and then whatever happens from there on. Basically, they will wipe Europeans out, is the idea here. So you must encounter the threat, or you must destroy the threat before it ever reaches Europe. Right. We're living in interesting times, and I think this story is kind of, it's good to bring this story back into discussion. We move next to a work from Bengal during the colonial period in India. And this is Premendra Mitra, one of the founders of Kalpavigyan, or science fiction from India. And this is a story from 1931, originally written in 1927 as a short story, as a story called Shekale Kotha, which means story from a past time, really. We don't know what past this is, but this is obviously a narration from some deep future. And the interesting thing about Premendra Mitra's Pipre Puran, unlike H.G. Wells, is that here the threat is not to the colonial empire, not to the discovery of Europe, but rather to the entire world. So humanity must unite to fight against these ants. After their second attack, the entire world became alert to the threat of these ants. In Peking, in China, representatives of all nations tried to come to an agreement about the necessary plan of action. All the nations of the world sent their battleships, airplanes, and army to South America to fight for the people in the remaining nations of South America. Note South America again, right? One of the things that we discovered when researching the history of ants in science fiction is that most of them begin in South America. But it's also interesting, the ways in which these different narratives play with time. If we read all these stories written across the 20th century all the way to the 21st century, we have some examples from there as well, you could actually see this as one history, just written by different people from different parts of the world. So we have Finnish writers, we have Japanese writers, we have writers from all over writing this. They're writing the same narrative about ants taking over. So you could write this as one history in science fiction. Next slide, please. And then we return to the centrality of the human, also in Premendra Mitra. It says, all the new things I learned about this species every single day would certainly be considered remarkable additions to human knowledge. So this is the protagonist who's living amongst the ants. He's been captured by the ants, and he's storing knowledge. Right? I would only describe the first thing required to know about them, that is their language and how I got to learn it. And there's the scientist ant, and the scientist ant who invents this device which allows the two species to communicate. The scientist ant was able to figure out this mystery of sound. I must praise his abilities, even if he is an enemy. Ants are the enemy, no matter where we go. After this, we have a short clip from them, which.
Now, these ants and related species are common to most of America. As a matter of fact, you can find them in backyards, empty lots, and fields throughout the temperate zones of the world. They haven't changed in either form or habits for more than 50 million years. Here, for instance, is one such specimen that got himself trapped in amber, which we know is at least that old. Now we come to some different kinds of ants. The big fellow there, feeding on the smaller red grease eaters, is of a savage species called Capanotus echinus minor. He's of a desert variety, very similar to the giant mutations we found in New Mexico. There is a side view of a small nest. Those white objects are ant eggs. Ants don't see well at all. They hear, smell, and locate objects entirely with their radar-like antennae. Only after food or an enemy is located with the antennae are the savage animals put to work. Now, gentlemen, watch this demonstration of power. A pebble has blocked the entrance to the nest. That creature is determined to remove the obstacle. Note how the mandibles are used to grasp the pebble and finally pull it aside with only a slight assist from another end. Now there's the same pebble on a laboratory scales. Balancing it is a dish containing 20 ants. We learned that one of these quarter-inch long insects can lift 20 times its own weight. That's equal to one of you lifting 1.5 tons or more. And here are rare shots of a newborn queen and her consorts. Technically, she should be referred to as a princess until after the mating flight. Now there is a close shot of a winged male. The males are unequipped for survival beyond the mating and die soon afterwards. The queen flies on, or more precisely, is borne by the wings until her need prompts her to seek a place to lay eggs.
Does a queen ever fly away from her nest once she's established it?
No, never. She loses her wings after the wedding flight. See, one has dropped off now. Now she starts her function of establishing a place in which to lay her eggs and begin the nest. Queens live quite a long time. They continue to lay eggs from the one mating for 15 to 17 years. Here are ants at war. As you can see, ants are savage, ruthless, and courageous fighters. This fight lasted 72 hours between those two alone. Ants are the only creatures on Earth, other than man, who make war. They campaign, they are chronic aggressors, and they make slave laborers of the captives they don't kill. None of the ants previously seen by man But even the most minute of them have an instinct and talent for industry, social organization, and savagery that makes man look feeble by comparison.
How large were the ants you found?
Oh, the smallest measured 9 feet in body length. That, gentlemen, is why you are here. Consider this problem, and I hope solve it. Because unless you solve it, unless these queens are located and destroyed before they've established thriving colonies and can produce, heaven alone knows how many more queen ants, man, as the dominant species of life on Earth, will probably be extinct within a year, Doctor. How much information, Senator? What's going on inside there? Sorry, boys, I'm trying.
Next slide, please. Yeah, ants, the history of the ants. It just continues. It just goes on and on. Them is the first of the big bug films. We are more aware of films like Mothra, for instance. But Them is where it all begins. It begins with the ants. But then we have a whole series of them. For instance, phase 4, in which ants are actually transforming humans into a different species. So they are, first they start to replicate human structures, human architecture and art, and they are able to produce mathematical notations, and then they eventually transform humans into their slaves, but also transform them into a different species altogether. I don't have a clip of that, unfortunately, but it is really bizarre and worth watching. Shalbas is a masterpiece, if one wants to call it that. We also have Empire of the Ants, which is kind of loosely based on the H.G. Wells narrative. But look at this. Radioactive waste, voracious ants, monsters, a chiller. Brace yourself for mutant mayhem and pestilent payback in this scary and repulsively convincing creature feature about good bugs gone bad. It's no picnic. And thus it goes on and on. These gigantic ants, from Them to phase 4. Scientifically they cannot actually become this big. Those legs wouldn't support the body weight, but that's a different issue. And then we have an even more interesting movie here called The Naked Jungle, same year as Phase 4, 1974, where Charlton Heston is fighting ants with a little pistol, revolver over there. And of course, it's all about the colonization of South America, So Charlton Heston, the white man, has established his dominance, has established this big colony in South America, and ants threaten everything, and he's going to fight them with a revolver. Amazing, right? And it goes on. This is like just a brief sampler of some of the other things that we were looking at, like Starship Troopers with Arachnoids and also with Ender's Game, with Children of Time, which actually features spiders, but also has a long section on ants, and these are about ant and spider evolution on another planet. Hannu Rajaniam is a Finnish author, his short story on ants as well, very recent. And in all these narratives, it's ants as the enemy. We are not able to think of the ants outside our very anthropocentric frameworks. We can't even imagine an anthropocentric framework. So what we tried to do is we looked at some other examples and fun examples of ants from E.O. Wilson, and then a little leafcutter ants from mastering Bitcoin and blockchain, and why are leafcutter ants so important to blockchain, perhaps.
In an internet-based society, online trade is consistently becoming more important. However, any
increasing number of parcels for delivery also means an increase in logistical complexity. Let's assume a German parcel delivery service has to deliver 40 parcels to different addresses all over Germany. To save time, the fastest route between the cities has to be found. If a computer were to calculate each individual route from Frankfurt to Düsseldorf to Berlin, as well as from Berlin to Frankfurt to Düsseldorf and so on, we would end up with 815 quattordecillion possibilities. That's an 8 with 47 zeros. And should even one of the cities change the next day, the routes have to be computed anew all over again. Even modern supercomputers cannot calculate such amounts. The ant colony optimization algorithm helps to find a solution to this. With a simple mathematical procedure, it simulates the routes in a way that is also used by ant colonies to find the best route while foraging for food. An ant that has discovered a short and efficient route will walk to and from the food source more frequently than another that walks a longer route. The colony notices this by the pheromones emitted by the faster ant, and so can identify the quickest route without having to try each one. With the ant colony optimization algorithm, the computer learns how to think like an ant colony and can calculate the fastest route much quicker. This helps the parcel delivery service to save on both time and fuel.
Thanks. Next slide, please.
Okay, let's...
Okay. I just love that clip, and I love it for, kind of bringing together what's the difference, between us and them. Where is innovation occurring? Where is processing occurring? Where is dealing with complex realities occurring? Innovation. The Argentine ants have had an amazing social innovation over the last couple of hundred years. They were kind of squeezed in a bottleneck going out of South America into North America. As they were squeezed into the bottleneck, it became evolutionarily valuable for the ants to not have the different nests, the different ant nests with the different queens that didn't recognize each other. And so what they did was created these super colonies where all of the ant nests would actually get on pretty well together, which now occur across Europe. It's a bit sad for me as a Brit to see this kind of togetherness in the ant community in Europe. But you have colonies that stretch all the way from southern Spain up into northern Finland, which recognize each other as part of the same colony. That is an amazing social innovation which has occurred basically within our life. All of the things that we say are exceptional, different, strange about humans, let's start to see the extent to which they're there in ants as well. I mentioned farming before. Alfred Russel Wallace, who was one of the co-founders with Darwin of evolutionary theory, was the first to discover this kind of concept of ant farming. Excuse me. So what Bodhi and I did in this paper was try and build together an ant manifesto and try and understand the world from the point of view of ants. One of the first things we wanted to argue was that there's no such thing, there's no nature-culture divide. This is a huge problem. It's a huge problem in thinking about biodiversity. It's assuming that humans exist outside of nature, and that we were kind of parachuted in by God at the last instance to provide the kind of stewardship of reality. That's bullshit. Humans, technology is very much part of nature. And unless we can see that about ourselves and our own technology, we can't understand the ants and their technology. Loads and loads of species play around with technology and deal with technology. Humans do that as well. But to say that we are somehow different, that we've created this other world, prevents us from looking at reality in interesting ways. So first of all, there is no nature-culture divide. Culture exists as a series of interpretations of nature. The technological is simultaneously natural and cultural. We've always been cyborg, we've always been many. So again, this decentering is, I think, central. Can we get the next slide, please? The question is, what is the unit of analysis? I often go back here to, all right, a lot of my world deals with computer scientists and the wet dreams of computer scientists, which right now is all about the idea of the singularity, which is considered very, very seriously within Silicon Valley. That we're all moving into this world where, suddenly everything, technology, culture, nature, they're all going to implode into each other, and we're moving into the next transformative phase of life on Earth. A much sweeter and nicer vision of that came from the fantastic Jesuit evolutionary theorist Chattopadhyay in the 1950s, who talked about the relevance of the noosphere. And this was the idea that the unit of analysis, the unit of development, is not humans or any particular species. The unit of development is the planet itself. And the planet itself is evolving. The planet itself is changing. We are part of that. We should celebrate the fact we are part of it and understand ourselves being part of it. At the very broadest scale, geodiversity begets biogeography, which begets geoengineering, which creates new forms of geodiversity and so forth in all kinds of temporal loops. It's an act of what Whitehead or Dewey would call misplaced concretism, to put humans at the center of evolutionary theory. It prevents it, because saying that it's about us, that it's about humans, precisely prevents us from understanding the nature of the issues. Next slide, please. So hybridity is central in the understanding of networks. A multi-species approach is step one in the understanding of hybridity. And we need that to understand distributed collective intelligence. And that's really what we're pushing for here, is an understanding of distributed collective intelligence. Next slide. So the ant network and ways in which we understand ants I think provides the basis of body, and I think provides the basis of planetarity. Since we are planetary, the rights of non-living must be considered as well as the rights of living, the living. So again, it's a unit of analysis question. It's all important around us, and again, to privilege life, first of all to privilege humans, then to privilege biological life, just moves us into a wrong form of ethics, a wrong form of values, which is central to our thinking about the future. Traces the non-living and the not yet living at the pheromone trail for ant network theory. So, Bodhi, I'm going to leave it to you to conclude.
What are these pheromone trails and how can we relate to them? One of the things that we are thinking of, and this is why we kind of end with traces of the non-living and the not yet living, and we go from assisted evolution and to the not yet living, is because we are trying to understand this as a cycle, also a non-linear cycle, something that is constantly regenerating, relocating, and moving. To take a couple of examples from the Anthropocene, take something like the plastic glomerate, which is a new kind of rock. It's a new kind of rock, it's a new kind of geological layer that artists and scientists are considering as the traces of our activity on this planet. It's a rock which has embedded in it plastics, right? But plastics are everywhere, plastics are in us, right? And plastics are also not non-living, in the sense that if we want to construct this history, then we go to the other part of it. We go to oil, we go to the production of plastic. We go further back into the oil, we find living matter. We go further back, we find something else, and we keep moving. We are not one, we are many. But to extend this idea further and further into the question of the Anthropocene is to recognize, or to the Anthropocene, is to recognize our kinship with everything, and then go from there and see where it takes us. Thank you.
Okay.
I would like to hear you just maybe specify a bit more the problem of the human exclusivity thing, where, I mean, looking at humans as something exclusive or exceptional, the problems with that in, I guess, trying to solve some of these problems that we are creating. But yeah,
Sure.
I just didn't really, I mean, I understand kind of the statement, I sympathize with it, but I would like you to maybe just say something a bit more concrete about it.
Sure, I think it's a great question. First of all, I'll go back to what I consider a classic paper by this evolutionary theorist McNeill about the ecosystem concept. A concept which is should be buried, I think he says, with full military honours. We should call it dead and bury it with full military honours. The reason for that, well, there are two reasons. One is that there's no such thing as an ecosystem, and kind of ecosystems which you put geographical limits around, and then you say that's a natural unit within there. Actually, organisms always move in and out of particular areas. You're much better looking at DEMES, D-E-M-E-S, which are populations, and populations always move. So the idea of an area that you can kind of put a limit around and say this is nature, and this is the natural form. Now, when you bring humans into the equation, that's the other thing the ecosystem concept has been used to do, is to say, well, there is nature out there is wilderness out there, and then there are humans who are acting generically, we fell under the spell of original sin and we started bringing evil into the world. And so, the role of humans, the way in which we understand human actions in the world, is like, oh my gosh, I wish we could just abstract ourselves from the center of existence. This was Charles Lyell's concept in Principles of Geology, where he said that basically, if humans went away within a couple of generations, everything would go back to normal, quote unquote normal, and we'd be back where nature is. There is no nature right now which is outside of humans, which is outside of human action. The reason why that's, I think, a particularly important political point to be making is that we can't start to imagine solutions if we imagine that somehow there is a pure world out there which we want to resurrect. There is no purity. I don't want purity. Purity is a bad thing. What's wonderful is the mix. What's wonderful is that we are part of the mix, and seeing ourselves as part of the mix and the flow, I think starts to, I mean this is an open question, but I think it starts to open new kinds of political horizon for us, as well as new kinds of scientific horizons. And the new kinds of political horizons, not based on blaming us or saying, what humans is doing is wrong. What humans do is pretty natural. Humans are like other species. We destroy species around us. That's what species like to do. We invade. That's what species like to do. There's nothing weird or strange about that. What is important is understanding this web of connectedness, and that we are all part of it. And seeing ourselves as all part of it creates new kinds of sensibility. And those new kinds of sensibility, I think, lead to new kinds of political action. Although I'm being slightly short on specifics there, so I apologize for that. Buddy?
I would just add to that purity point that Michel Serres' book, Maleficence, does a great job of talking about pollution and purity and the political implications of the purity discourse. It's a discourse that we face again and again, for instance, in fascism, in cultural purity, in human purity, humans versus the ants, one race against another, one ethnicity against another, one culture against another. And it's premised on purity. The notion of pollution is kind of important.
Yeah, just building on that slightly, I mean, I think that, one of the arguments I like to use a lot now, which is, not alone to me, Ms. Lynn Margulis makes the point, Don Haraway makes the point, we are a commonwealth of being. 90% of the cells in your body are microflora and microfauna. The idea of inside the human and outside the human is a very, very strange concept that, we've got. One of the things they're playing with right now in biological circles is the idea of the exposome. So you've got the microflora and fauna which exist inside your body, but also within your house, within your apartment, you actually have a whole separate set of microflora and fauna which are specific to that house, which is specific to you. So where do you exist? You don't exist inside the body as a form of genetic code, as this kind of separate kind of entity. You exist within a whole web of parasitism, keyword for Serre, and symbiosis. And that's in the built environment around you, it's in the world around you, it's within your body, and it's always, one way of understanding the whole gastric system is the outside within. This kind of folded reality where we fold the outside into ourselves. So creating this whole kind of unitary concept, this whole kind of unitary purity concept, prevents us from seeing just this web of, absolutely beautiful web of symbiosis and parasitism, which is the very basis of life. There's one here.
Yeah. It's very interesting, and this kind of flows. But kind of this idea of non-purity, of pollution, of parasitic encounters. In one way, I agree, it kind of gives hope because it accepts difference and different interests. I'm thinking, for instance, of environmental discourse now, where we are fighting about windmills, right? Some want them and some don't want them. And the argument is we need it in Norway. So there's a unity, which is too massive. But then, can it be risky too? The notion of pollution or the notions of flows and non-unities in a way. Do they have some risks? Because picking ideas from science and turning them into social science in a way, or social theory of how society can work better, also has a history of risky, or kind of a dark history in a way. Yeah. So have you thought about the potential kind of, what can be risky about this new metaphors, this new way of thinking, the way the world works?
I always love when the difficult questions come along. First of all, let's quote Michel Tournier. That's one of my favourite quotes. "Beware of purity is a vitriol of the soul," and I absolutely believe that. I mean, I do believe that there is something deeply wrong with any discourse that's around purity. It's a risk to the other side, yeah, absolutely. I mean, the risk in the discourse that I've just given you is. You could just say, well, just let it happen. And part of me just wants to let it happen. I mean, part of me says, well, humans are interesting. We've had our time on Earth. I'm not particularly attached to humans surviving all that much longer. I don't particularly care if humans survive all that much longer. I don't think it's even interesting in evolutionary terms. Is it risky for me to say, well, risky for who? Risky for what? I guess then becomes the question. And what's really interesting for me is preserving the ability to change. We don't think about that enough in biodiversity terms. I mean, the whole climate discourse is, let's keep the temperature like it is. Or in biodiversity terms, let's keep the current set of species that we have. And it's risky to let it go, in the sense, why are you not drifting into a completely kind of passive, kind of, life's beautiful, life's going to win out in the end, everything's going to be hunky-dory. I still want political action, and I still want political action urgently now. Question is, I want the ants to be part of the political action. I want the bees to be part of the political action as well as us. But yeah, I mean, yeah, I think it's a passivity which is the ultimate danger. But yeah.
I would also like to add to the whole purity discourses, how purity is created, right? And purity for whom? Who's talking about purity? And that's kind of important, right? So if we again like go back to the ants or to other examples really from science fiction, or actually let's not take science fiction, let's take science reality or our reality and the kind of technological produce that we use constantly, right? Like the iPhones and so on. Where does the waste go, right? Where's the trash going? To keep our streets clean, where's the trash going? And immediately you get the question, oh yes, we are getting purity over here, pure clean air, while China gets destroyed, right? While India gets destroyed, well, most of the world gets destroyed really in order to preserve a certain space of purity. So it's very important to ask the question, purity for who? Who's asking the question? Who's raising that point about purity?
I have a kind of interesting, since today, maybe earlier, I was also thinking of Philip K. Dick, and he has a specific, he talks about something, the idea that the actual time plane is orthogonal to ours, in an essay I think called Human, Android and the Machine, something like that. So I was curious about your own perception of which is more asymptotic, and then it could easily reach, like within the infinite, how things...
Yeah, sure.
I hope that made sense, but because now, I don't have it like well phrased.
That's fine. I'll have a go. I'll leave it to you, buddy. I'm not certain I can fully make sense to that. First of all, I'd be very interested in I thought I knew all Philip K. Dick. I do not know this reference, and I'd be really, really interested in what he'd written about the time plane there. I think that sounds fascinating. I think generically, there's this concept, that we've kind of fallen into in the last couple of hundred years. Time is going faster and faster and faster. Yeah. We're in the middle of some kind of acceleration. We're not. The whole idea of acceleration, again, is it's a bright, shiny object that makes us think, wow, look at that, things are going faster and faster and faster. Rubbish. They're going about the same pace they were ever going. If you take really simple things, everybody refers to technological change. The white heat of technological change. We had internet in my lifetime, followed by the iPhone, followed by blah blah blah. Everything faster and faster and faster. Now that concept that things are going faster and faster and faster, I certainly trace it back to the early 19th century. And the early 19th century was, 10 years in current Britain are equal to 1,000 years of old Cathay or old China. That was an argument that was made in the 1820s or 1830s. So this idea that we're caught up in a spinning top, which is taking us to things like the singularity. So that there's a marvelous, Geoffrey West used this in his book on scale. He's got this kind of, there's all of these asymptotic curves that we're part of, and we need faster and faster technological change to deal with continued economic growth. So we're going to have to keep going faster and faster and faster, more and more asymptotes, until finally, basically, according to the Kurzweil vision of the singularity, it's going to be within a quarter of our lifetimes. So basically, sometime in the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to hit singularity.
We've been pushing it.
You keep pushing it, yeah. And there's something that's really attractive about that idea. But again, it's a kind of, it's another form of exceptionalism. It's saying that our time is a very special time. There is so many processes that we're part of that are actually really, really slow as they've ever been, as interesting as they've ever been. I think it's by looking at the things that seem to accelerate more and more and more, takes us away from, the fundamental injustices that the Anthropocene. That's not something we invented over the last 50 years, or the last couple hundred years, or the last 1,000 years. That's coeval with us as a species, and it's been moving as slowly and as deliberately as the development of the species has been. And so every time when I see talk of, we need to move in, we need to understand the asymptotic nature of time today, I just say, well, that's wrong. It's a shell game. It's drawing our attention from the place where the real action is. And that place where the real action is happening at different kinds of temporalities. That's exactly why Michel Bastien, she doesn't succeed at the end, but she talks about things, well, let's take leatherback turtles as our clocks. because leatherback turtles have lived much longer than we do. They've got a really different kind of evolutionary history. But it'd be really interesting to kind of clock our species and clock life instead of dealing with this ever faster time within the clock. And that's, sorry, slide aside, although I think I can connect it up. One thing I'm really interested in right now is we're creating these new levels of ontological reality at very, very fast periods of time. And that's what computer time is doing right now. It's creating these new entities, these new ways of being at incredibly fast periods of time. And yes, there is something very interesting about that, but it's certainly not the only interesting thing that's doing. Certainly not the only interesting temporality or even the dominant temporality. So, you know, it's not that there isn't some kind of acceleration, of course there is. It's, you know, it's that drawing attention to that all of the time draws our attention away from all of the different temporalities which we are woven into and a part of, which is precisely drawing attention away. This kind of sense of urgency about everything all of the time. It's not that urgent. I mean, it sounds horrible saying that, you know, because, yeah, I mean, climate change is awful, and, you know, well, climate change is wonderful, but, you know, the damage that we're doing to the environment is absolutely awful. But seeing it in terms of, we need to do something right now, in this breathless sense, prevents us from moving in precisely the kinds of politics and policies which deal with the very, very long term, which deal with not the next 20 years, not the next 200 years, but the next 10,000, the next 100,000 years. Those are the temporal scales that we need to be thinking of, we need to bring into our lives now, much more centrally than we do.
Yeah, no, I would just add to that we are both a part of a project based at the University of Oslo called Lifetimes. We have a website, temporalities.no. Please visit the website. All we do is time, and we talk about time all the time, but we don't talk about one time, we talk about many times. So one of the key conceptual breakthroughs, but also one of the central arguments that we consistently and constantly make is about multiple temporalities. It's not about one linear time scale, drawing attention to one time scale and working with that. So we have everything from politics and government to quantum to climate fiction to many other things. And we also have a bunch of great lectures by amazing speakers in there. So please do visit, please do check it out. Yeah.